hurt you, Winham. She wanted him to disappear.
But I am in charge here.
She wished for his disappearance, whispered it into her pillow night after night, but she never imagined that her trusted house servant would be the one to make it happen, or the terrible price they would all pay for such a wish. Have you ever trusted someone with your darkest thoughts only to watch as they use those very secrets to claim power over you? That cold realization when someone you believed was beneath you reveals they were playing a longer, more calculated game all along. The drawing room of Willow Creek Plantation in 1851, Virginia smelled of beeswax polish and the lingering scent of the mistress's French perfume. The heavy velvet curtains filtered the afternoon sunlight into thin golden streams that illuminated dust motes dancing above the polished mahogany furniture. In this seemingly peaceful setting, two women existed in vastly different worlds. One wore silk, the other homespun cotton. One gave orders, the other appeared to obey. But appearances in the antebellum South were often deceiving, and power flowed through channels unseen by those who believed they held it all. Eleanor Blackwood had been mistress of Willow Creek for just over 3 years, ever since her marriage to Thomas Blackwood, a widower 20 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond his treatment of the people he enslaved. His first wife had died under circumstances that invited whispers throughout the county, though no one dared speak their suspicions aloud. Eleanor, young and beautiful with honey blonde hair and clear blue eyes that could charm any gentleman in Virginia society, had initially seemed pleased with her elevated position. The daughter of a merchant who had lost his fortune, she had married Thomas for security and status. What she had not anticipated was the isolation of plantation life, or the violent temper of her husband that emerged when they were alone. Mercy had been assigned as Eleanor's personal servant shortly after the new mistress arrived. At 30 years old, Mercy had spent her entire life at Willow Creek, having been born in the slave quarters behind the main house. Her mother had been the previous mistress's lady's maid until her death 5 years earlier. Mercy had skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. She moved through the house like a shadow, observing everything while appearing to notice nothing. The other house servants warned new arrivals that Mercy had the ear of both master and mistress and that crossing her could mean being sold downriver. What they did not know was how carefully Mercy had cultivated this perception and how deliberately she had positioned herself at the center of the household's information flow. The relationship between mistress and servant shifted on a stormy April evening when Thomas Blackwood returned from a 3-day trip to Richmond in a foul mood. Eleanor had been playing the pianoforte in the parlor, a melancholy tune that matched the rain lashing against the windows. When Thomas entered, his boots tracking mud across the Persian carpet, he criticized her playing, her choice of evening dress, and finally her failure to produce an heir after 3 years of marriage. Mercy stood in the corner of the room, seemingly focused on her mending, but her ears caught every cruel word and every stifled sob from her mistress. Later that night, as she brushed Eleanor's hair with long, rhythmic strokes, she watched tears slide down the younger woman's pale cheeks. "I wish he would just disappear," Eleanor whispered so softly that the words seemed meant only for herself. "Just vanish one day and never return." Mercy's hands never faltered in their task, but her eyes met Eleanor's in the mirror. For a brief moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended their positions. In that unguarded exchange, Eleanor revealed a vulnerability that Mercy recognized immediately as an opportunity. "Yes, Miss Eleanor," Mercy replied, her voice gentle as flowing water over smooth stones. "Sometimes God answers the prayers we are afraid to speak aloud." The mistress said nothing more that night, but from that moment forward, the nature of their relationship had fundamentally changed. Over the following weeks, Mercy became Eleanor's confidant. The mistress revealed more of her unhappiness, her fear of her husband, and increasingly, her desperation to be free of him. Mercy listened with apparent sympathy, offering small comforts and subtle encouragements. What Eleanor did not realize was that Mercy had been cultivating relationships throughout the plantation and beyond for years. She had cousins among the field hands, connections with servants in neighboring plantations, and most importantly, an arrangement with Silas, Thomas Blackwood's valet, who shared her bed when the master was away. Through this network, Mercy knew that Thomas Blackwood had gambling debts in Richmond, that he had sold 3 field hands without informing the overseer to cover these debts, and that he had recently begun visiting a free black woman in town, a relationship that would scandalize Virginia society if discovered. Mercy began carefully planting seeds in her conversations with Eleanor. She mentioned strange financial documents she glimpsed while cleaning the master's study. She relayed gossip about Thomas being seen entering a certain house on the edge of town late at night. She spoke of overhearing the master discussing plans to sell some of the household servants, including Mercy herself, to settle unnamed obligations. With each new revelation, Eleanor's fear and resentment grew. Eventually, as Mercy had anticipated, the mistress began asking questions about ways to protect herself should Thomas's financial situations worsen. "What if," Eleanor asked one evening as Mercy arranged her hair for dinner, "what if something happened to Thomas? Would the plantation come to me, or would his brother inherit?" Mercy responded with carefully measured information about other widows she had known, how some had managed to secure their positions while others had been cast out penniless. Unknown to Eleanor, Mercy was simultaneously working another angle. Through Silas, she fed Thomas Blackwood information about his wife's supposedly growing closeness with Dr. James Collins, the handsome young physician who had attended Eleanor during a brief illness in February. She made sure Thomas noticed the volume of poetry the doctor had lent Eleanor. She arranged for Thomas to overhear conversations between house servants, discussing how the mistress brightened whenever the doctor visited. Though the relationship between Eleanor and the doctor was entirely innocent, Mercy's carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers and suggestions inflamed Thomas's jealousy and reinforced his sense that his young wife was slipping from his control. The plan Mercy was crafting required patience and precise timing. She needed Thomas's suspicions and Eleanor's resentment to reach their peak simultaneously. She needed the master to act rashly but in a specific way. Most importantly, she needed to ensure her own position remained secure regardless of the outcome. Throughout the early summer, she continued her dual manipulation, watching as husband and wife grew increasingly cold toward each other, their rare conversations tense and formal. Eleanor spent more time alone in her room or walking the gardens. Thomas drank more heavily and stayed away from the plantation for days at a time. The opportunity Mercy had been waiting for arrived in late July. Thomas announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to Charleston on business and would be gone for at least 2 weeks. Eleanor made no response beyond a slight nod, keeping her eyes on her barely touched plate. Mercy, standing by the sideboard, noted the tight set of Thomas's jaw and the way his hand clenched around his coffee cup. After breakfast, as Mercy helped Eleanor change into a walking dress, she mentioned casually that she had seen Dr. Collins on the road to the plantation earlier that morning. His visit was expected. He was coming to check on one of the pregnant kitchen servants, but Mercy presented the information as though it were surprising and potentially scandalous. "I want to pause this story for a moment to ask you directly. When was the last time you trusted someone and felt that stab in your chest, that silent warning that something wasn't right? I know you may never have shared this with anyone. It's that pain we keep thinking no one will understand. But here, in this space we're creating together, your experience matters. If you've felt this silent betrayal, leave in the comments just the words, 'I recognize this feeling,' and see how many people share this invisible wound. Your comment could be the first step for someone to realize they're not alone on this journey." Let's continue the story now, but carrying this reflection with us. The day proceeded as normal on the surface. Dr. Collins did indeed visit, spending most of his time in the slave quarters attending to Lily, the pregnant kitchen servant who had been experiencing pains. He spoke briefly with Eleanor about Lily's condition in the garden, a conversation observed by multiple house servants, including Mercy. When Thomas returned from his business in town late that afternoon, Mercy made sure he heard about the doctor's visit and the garden conversation through Silas. That evening, Thomas drank more bourbon than usual in his study, sending Silas away earlier than was his custom. Mercy, moving silently through the darkened hallways of the main house after the other servants had retired to their quarters, slipped a folded note under the study door before disappearing back into the shadows. The note, written in a careful hand on paper Mercy had taken from Eleanor's writing desk, contained only a few lines. "My dearest J. T leaves for Charleston tomorrow. 2 weeks of freedom await us. Come to me. Forever yours, E." The handwriting was close enough to Eleanor's to fool a man who paid little attention to his wife's correspondence, especially one whose judgment was clouded by bourbon and jealousy. Mercy knew Thomas would recognize the initials immediately, just as she knew that his pride would never allow him to confront his wife directly with evidence of her supposed infidelity. Men like Thomas Blackwood dealt with such matters through action, not words. The next morning dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of a summer storm. Thomas Blackwood appeared at breakfast looking haggard, his eyes bloodshot and his manner distracted. He announced curtly that his departure for Charleston had been delayed by a day, but that he would be riding into town for meetings and would return late. Eleanor, who had been planning a quiet day of reading and correspondence, merely nodded her acknowledgement. Mercy watched the exchange from her position near the door, her face revealing nothing of her anticipation. After Thomas departed, Mercy assisted Eleanor with her morning toilette and then suggested that the mistress might enjoy having lunch served in the gazebo, as the gardens were particularly lovely despite the heat. Eleanor agreed, unaware that Mercy had already instructed the kitchen to prepare the mistress's favorite dishes and to send Thomas's best wine from the cellar. While Eleanor wrote letters in her sitting room, Mercy slipped away to the small cottage at the edge of the property, where Dr. Collins sometimes stayed when attending to medical emergencies on the plantation. She left a note similar to the one she had placed under Thomas's door, but this one purportedly from the overseer, requesting the doctor's immediate assistance with an injured field hand. By mid-afternoon, the gazebo had been prepared for Eleanor's lunch. White linen covered the small table, crystal glasses caught the sunlight, and a bouquet of fresh roses from the garden provided both beauty and fragrance. Eleanor was delighted by the special attention, assuming it was Mercy's way of lifting her spirits during her husband's absence. She did not question why the table was set for two, assuming Mercy would join her as she sometimes did when the master was away. However, as Eleanor sipped her wine and enjoyed the relative peace of the garden, it was Dr. Collins who appeared on the path leading to the gazebo, looking confused, but pleased to find the mistress there. Mercy had calculated every element perfectly. From her vantage point near the kitchen garden, she could see both the gazebo and the approach from the main road to the plantation. She watched as the doctor joined Eleanor, saw their conversation grow animated as the doctor explained the mysterious note, and Eleanor denied sending it. She observed Eleanor's gesture inviting him to join her for lunch nonetheless, noted how their heads inclined toward each other as they spoke, and, precisely on schedule, she saw Thomas Blackwood's horse galloping up the main drive, the master having returned far earlier than expected due to a note Mercy had arranged to have delivered to him in town, warning him of a situation requiring his immediate attention at Willow Creek. What happened next unfolded with a terrible swiftness. Thomas Blackwood, already primed by weeks of carefully planted suspicions and the forged note, came upon his wife and the doctor sharing lunch and wine in the intimate setting of the gazebo. Their actual conversation, an innocent discussion of books and local news, mattered not at all to a man convinced of his wife's betrayal. Witnesses later reported hearing the master's roar of rage from hundreds of yards away. They described how he stormed into the gazebo, overturning the table and lunging at the startled doctor. They recounted the struggle that ensued, how Eleanor screamed for help, how Thomas drew the pistol he always carried when traveling and fired at the retreating doctor, the bullet striking him in the back. They told of Eleanor's horrified attempts to reach the fallen doctor, and Thomas's rough handling of his wife as he dragged her back toward the house, shouting accusations of infidelity and treachery. What no witness could have known was that Mercy had anticipated exactly this sequence of events. She had positioned trusted members of her network nearby, people whose testimony would later prove crucial. She had arranged for the plantation overseer to be elsewhere during the critical hour. She had ensured that the forged notes would never be found, and most importantly, she had made certain that Thomas Blackwood's violent actions would have an audience large enough to ensure the story spread throughout the county by nightfall. Dr. Collins did not die immediately. He lingered for 3 days, long enough to give a statement to the sheriff attesting to his innocence and Eleanor's, long enough for the scandal to grow from whispers to open conversation, long enough for Thomas Blackwood's standing in the community to crumble as even his friends distanced themselves from a man who had shot an unarmed physician in the back. Throughout those 3 days, Thomas raged through the house, alternately threatening Eleanor with violence and locking himself in his study with his bourbon. Eleanor remained in her room, attended only by Mercy, who brought her food and comfort, and whispered reassurances that this nightmare would soon end. On the evening of the 3rd day, as a summer thunderstorm lashed the plantation with rain and wind, Thomas Blackwood took his own life with the same pistol he had used to shoot Dr. Collins. His body was discovered by Silas, who came to the study when his master failed to appear for dinner. The official determination was that grief and remorse over his actions had driven Thomas to suicide. Only Mercy knew about the second note she had slipped under his door that afternoon, supposedly from the sheriff, indicating that witnesses had come forward with evidence that Thomas had planned the doctor's murder in advance, an offense that would surely lead to the gallows. The unexpected twist in this carefully orchestrated tragedy came the following morning. As the household attempted to absorb the shock of the master's death, a writer arrived from Richmond bearing news that would change everything. Thomas Blackwood's financial situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. His gambling debts had mounted to the point that he had mortgaged Willow Creek to multiple creditors. The plantation, its land, its buildings, and most devastating of all, the people enslaved there, would be sold at auction within the month to satisfy his creditors. Eleanor Blackwood, now a widow without property or income, faced a future of dependence on reluctant relatives. The enslaved community at Willow Creek confronted the terrifying prospect of being separated and sold to new masters, possibly further south where conditions were known to be even harsher. Mercy, whose plan had succeeded in eliminating Thomas Blackwood but had not accounted for the extent of his financial ruin, now found herself in as precarious a position as everyone else on the plantation. But Mercy had one final card to play. In the weeks following Thomas's death, as preparations for the auction proceeded, she revealed to Eleanor the existence of documents hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of Thomas's study. These papers, which Mercy claimed to have discovered while cleaning shortly after coming into Eleanor's service, proved that Thomas had engaged in fraudulent business practices, forging signatures on loan documents and falsifying property records. The documents themselves were actually clever forgeries created by a free black man in Richmond who specialized in such work, a man connected to Mercy through her extensive network. Mercy suggested to Eleanor that these papers could be used to negotiate with Thomas's creditors, threatening to expose their involvement in his schemes if they proceeded with the auction. Eleanor, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of her life, agreed to Mercy's plan. Together they approached the most significant of Thomas's creditors with their evidence. The resulting negotiations were complex and protracted, but ultimately successful. The auction was cancelled. Eleanor retained ownership of the house and a portion of the land. Most importantly to Mercy, the enslaved community remained intact and at Willow Creek, though their legal status remained unchanged. In the aftermath, Eleanor found herself in the unexpected position of running a much-reduced plantation with limited resources. Lacking experience and confidence, she came to rely heavily on Mercy's knowledge of the estate's operations. Gradually, Mercy's role evolved from lady's maid to de facto household manager and then to Eleanor's business partner in all but name. The unusual arrangement raised eyebrows in Virginia society, but Eleanor, already ostracized due to the scandal surrounding her husband's death, had little left to lose in terms of social standing. What none of the white community ever discovered was the true extent of Mercy's influence and her long-term plan. Over the following years, she used her position to improve conditions for the enslaved people at Willow Creek. She arranged for families that had been separated to be reunited. She negotiated for those with specialized skills to hire out their own time and keep a portion of their earnings. She established a secret school where the children learned to read and write, knowledge that was forbidden to enslaved people by Virginia law, and most significantly, she began using the plantation's reduced but still significant resources to purchase freedom papers for members of the community, beginning with her own family members and extending outward in widening circles. The ultimate irony of the story of Willow Creek Plantation is that Eleanor Blackwood, who had once whispered her wish for her husband to disappear, never fully understood that she had been as much Mercy's pawn as Thomas had been. The mistress believed until her death 15 years later that she and Mercy had formed a partnership born of mutual hardship and shared goals. She never recognized that every step of her journey from frightened young wife to independent widow had been guided by Mercy's invisible hand. She never suspected that the woman she came to consider her closest friend had orchestrated the events that both destroyed and ultimately liberated her. For Mercy, the legacy of her actions was complex. She had achieved her primary goal of improving conditions for her community and securing freedom for many. By the time Eleanor died in 1866, after the Civil War had officially ended slavery, but before the realities of Reconstruction had fully manifested, Mercy had established herself as a businesswoman in her own right, using the knowledge and connections she had cultivated over decades. Yet she carried with her the weight of her role in Thomas Blackwood's death and the near death of the innocent Dr. Collins. She understood better than most how power operates in shadows, how oppressive systems can be manipulated from within, and how freedom sometimes requires terrible choices. The story of Mercy and Eleanor offers us a profound lesson about the nature of power and betrayal during one of America's darkest periods. In a system designed to strip enslaved people of all agency, some found ways to exert control through the careful collection and deployment of information. In a society that treated human beings as property, the most significant acts of resistance often occurred not through open rebellion, but through calculated manipulation of those who believed themselves to be in charge. The betrayal at the heart of this story is multi-layered. Thomas betrayed basic human decency through his participation in the slave system, Eleanor betrayed her own moral compass by wishing death on her husband, and Mercy betrayed her mistress's trust by using her vulnerability as a weapon. Yet perhaps the greatest betrayal was that of the system itself, which promised order and civilization while being built upon a foundation of profound injustice. Mercy's actions, morally ambiguous as they were, represented not just her individual response to oppression, but a reflection of the distorted moral universe that slavery created, where good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, became hopelessly entangled. In the end, the servant did indeed show who was truly in charge, not through open confrontation, but through the patient exercise of hidden power, turning the master's weapons of deception and manipulation against himself. If these stories of courage and betrayal during the slavery era touch your heart as they touch mine, I invite you to join our community. By subscribing to the channel, you'll have access to carefully researched stories that reveal long-hidden truths about our past, helping to understand wounds that still echo in our society. It's not just about knowing history, but about honoring the memory of those who lived these realities. Click subscribe and let's journey together in discovery and reflection.